Hello everyone, back tuning in to today's third video. We're going to verify the winter 2018-19 forecast for today's third video. So this is your winter 18-19 GWV forecast verification video. So back at the end of November, beginning of December, we released the GWV.com winter 2018-19 forecast. The forecast was going for a slightly colder than an average winter and a drier than average winter with some caveats, and I'll talk you through how the forecast performed and what actually happened for the winter during the winter very shortly. Just say that the two videos released so far today, we released first of all the first batch of summer analog, so the long range bandwagon has rolled on to summer updates. That video is currently on the homepage, and later on today it will be placed on the summer 2019 updates and forecast page with a written summary going over everything we discussed in the video. And also GWV Sunny Roundup map video also is on the homepage. Right, so let's get on with the forecast verification. I'm on right now the winter 2018-19 forecast and updates page at GWV. So this is the page that we have the video on, and all of the winter update videos are on this page as well. There's the winter 2018-19 forecast. So just scrolling down, I'll tell you what the actual forecast was. First of all, we went through our analogues, of course, and I'll talk about those in a moment. But moving down to the forecast, we said that we were predicting a slightly colder than average winter with temperature anomalies around half a degree to 1 degree below the 81 to 2010 average. A drier than average winter was also expected overall, but we thought there might be some milder wetter interludes that were likely to interrupt the colder phase, and so that's the reason we was only going for slightly colder than average winter. We thought December would probably come out around or slightly milder than average, and then January and February we thought were likely to be colder than average. January, particularly in our analogues package, January particularly was showing up as potentially being the coldest month, but then there was also ENSO and QBO data that was suggesting February might be the coldest month. But either way, we thought both months would probably be somewhat colder than average. However, we did put in a caveat, and we said that excuse me, we said equally a mild or very mild winter can't be discounted, particularly as 1937 and 1913 were proving such close analog matches to 2018. So you remember that, and I'll talk more about this as we go along, but the top two analogues were 1937 and 1913, and they were both milder winters. So we said we didn't see any fence sitting about this winter. We thought it was either going to be very either cold or mild to very mild. We said that we favoured a slightly colder than average winter for our forecast as what we think is like to be most. Let's try that again. We said that we've favoured slightly colder than average for our forecast as what we think is the most likely outcome. But if this forecast fails, it will do so spectacularly. And that little note of caution did prove pretty decisive, really, and I think that's an important caveat to put in, particularly in light of what's happened, because these are the winter 2018 19 temperature anomalies from the UK Met set against the 81 to 2010 average. You see, it was a very mild winter across all parts of the country, particularly mild across Northern Ireland, England and Wales, where we was over 1.5 degrees up to 2 degrees above average through the central parts of England and Wales, so through the Midlands into Wales and over towards Northern Ireland as well. Exceptionally mild winter. Other places had a very mild winter, going up to like 1 degree to 1.5 degrees above average. Eastern Scotland comes out closest to average. They're just half a degree to 1 degree above the 81 to 2010 average. But wherever you are, it was a milder than average winter, and quite significantly so. It's also a drier than average winter, so that side of the forecast, let's not forget it, we did go for a drier than average winter, and that side of the forecast did come off quite well. So it was a very dry winter for much of Scotland and northeastern parts of England, but really most parts of the country away from like the far northwest of Scotland, some parts of West Wales and some of these extreme southern parts of the country. Most places actually did come away with a drier than average winter, so it seems that side of the forecast went reasonably well. Now, our Analysis guru James has had a look at the reanalysis for this winter, so let's just deal with that first of all and see how the pattern developed through winter. So this is the 500 millibar height anomaly for December 2018, and this was a dry and mild month. It has above average heights to our south, but also ridging through the UK with, interestingly, quite a northern blocking signal up here. So it did have some northern blocking, but we had this high pressure like extending down through the west of Europe, and so what this did, it put us onto the mild side of the jet stream. The jet was doing something a little bit like that, I reckon. So it's an unusual sort of pattern, but the upshot was we had high pressure to our south, and that was bringing up mild or very mild air from southern climes. Now, as we go through to January, what we find in January is that the pattern did go colder. So we got an area of above average heights then setting up out to our west during January. So high pressure kind of like repositioned and moved out into the Atlantic, but did also extend up towards the north as well, with quite a deep trough extending through much of Central and Eastern Europe. So a much colder pattern for many parts of Europe. Very often we was on the periphery of that, but certainly the final 2 weeks of January did go colder. Now, our analogues were always suggesting that January was likely to be the coldest month of the winter. It wasn't a spectacularly cold month by any means, but it was the coldest month of the winter, and that was something that was a little bit apparent in our analogues package as well. Now, as we get through to February, this is how February looks in terms of the 500 millibar height anomaly. For February, it has an area of above average heights, just centred really across most of Central and Northern Europe. It has quite a deep trough of below average heights in the Atlantic, and so that leaves us pulling up very warm air, very mild air from southern climes. So again, we're close to high pressure. There's a lot of dry weather going on, but also it's very mild, and we get a very warm February indeed. The overall winter 2018-19 analogues come out looking like this. So this is the analogue for winter 2018-19. Very anticyclonic winter, has a northern blocking signal, interestingly, to our north, but it also has a strong area of above average heights centred kind of like to our south-southwest. So it's a very bizarre sort of pattern, very, very odd pattern really for the winter 2018-19, but the upshot is, although we do have a colder interlude in January, generally this is a mild to very mild winter, but with such a strong anticyclonic signal, it's also a really dry winter as well. This is how the temperature anomalies develop through the winter. So for December 2018, obviously a much milder than average month, above average temperature anomalies there for the UK and for much of Europe as well. This is how the temperature anomaly looks for January. Notice much colder month in many parts of Europe during January. It is cooler for the UK as well. Our temperature anomaly comes out very close to average, but you'll notice that for most parts of Europe, this is actually quite a cold month, particularly sort of France, down to Spain, Portugal, but also some of these northern eastern parts of Europe. It is a colder month for Europe during January. And then as we get through to February, it just goes really mild, actually quite warm, and not just for the UK, but for the vast majority of Europe. Actually, we come away with a very mild, if not a really warm month in February. The overall winter 2018-19 temperature anomaly looks like that, so it's a much milder than average winter, not only for the UK but for most parts of Europe as well. Precipitation-wise, this is how the precipitation anomalies are looking. So it's actually a rather wet December to the southwest of the country. Other places are coming out quite close to average. Then January goes really quite dry, particularly to northern and western parts of the country, and then we get through to February, and it's very close to average now, which is quite surprising, really, given it was a very anticyclonic month. But we do have to remember that we did have quite an unsettled start to February. The first week to 10 days was actually quite unsettled. Overall precipitation anomalies for winter 2018-19 come out drier than average. So that's how the winter stacks up in terms of the heights and also temperature and precipitation anomalies. But what about our forecast? Well, we have real problems with our forecast, because when we group together all of our top 10 analogues, we actually had a signal for quite a cold winter. That's kind of like the base point to start with for the winter analogues and the winter forecast. The top 10 analogues were pointing us towards a cold winter with northern blocking and low pressure down to our south and favouring sort of easterly winds. So that's sort of like the base point, the starting point for the winter forecast, that our top 10 analogues were kind of like pointing us towards a colder type winter pattern. But as we drill down into the best analogues, that started to change a little bit. So our top 7 winter 2018-19 analogues, for example, were looking like this. This is how December was looking. It did have a northern blocking signal in December with our top 7 analogues with below average heights to our south. So that would kind of like favour quite a coldish pattern in December. But you notice that we go through to January, and that northern blocking signal is still there to some degree, but it's reducing and it's weakening quite a lot. The below average heights are still to our south, so overall probably still, with the top 7 analogues, probably still favouring a relatively cold type pattern during January. But by the time you get through to February, look at this, we get a much milder pattern with our top 7 analogues in February, with above average heights over to our east and below average heights to our southwest. So this will bring up much milder air. It will be rather unsettled, but it brings up much milder air from a southerly or southwesterly type direction. So the top 7 analogues were favouring cold early in the winter and then moving to something milder later on, and that's how March was shaping up as well. So March also had a bit of a northern blocking signal, but with below average heights to our southwest, actually that would be relatively mild, bringing winds up from a sort of southerly to southwesterly direction. The overall winter 2018-19 analogue, in terms of 500 millibar heights with the top 7, looks like that. So overall, still quite a cold descent. It does have a northern blocking signal, but less so compared to the top 10, with below average heights much closer to us, threatening milder air from the Atlantic at times. Nevertheless, you would probably still favour, particularly earlier in the winter, colder conditions with those top 7 analogues. But if you drill down even further and just bring this down to the top 2, then it gets very interesting. This is what we was talking about in the winter forecast, and the reason we put that caveat in, that if this forecast for a slightly colder than average winter failed, it would do so spectacularly. And it was because of these top 2 analogue years, 1913 and 1937. So that's like the winter of 1913-14, and then the winter of 1937-1938. Now, for December, we still had a signal for a coldish month, even with these 2 analogue years. We had an area of above average heights out to our west, but also to the north with below average heights over to the east. You will probably get some modification from the Atlantic, be bringing in a bit of an Atlantic flow, but nevertheless, there's a trough within the 500 millibar flow, so overall, you will probably still favour a rather coldish month in December. But as you get through to January, look what happens. It starts to look much more westerly in January. So you've got this trough of below average heights extending to our east, quite interestingly. But you also have low pressure around Greenland and Iceland and high pressure out to the west-southwest of the UK, which would favour a westerly flow. So for January, you can see already we're beginning to move into a milder winter-type pattern with these two winters, our top two, 1913, 1914 and 1937, 1938. And look at February. So it's not an identical match to February 2019 by any means, but the broad idea, I think, is kind of there. We've got below average heights in the Atlantic, got a trough in the Atlantic. You'll never get like for like. What we do with this is pick out the best analogues of what we think will be the closest sort of matches to this year, but you will never get a 100% like-to-like match. So for these two Februaries, 1914, 1938, we get low pressure in the Atlantic, but we get this large ridge that's across sort of central and northeastern parts of Europe. And what this does, it will favour bringing up a mild, potentially a very mild, southerly flow. So this would definitely, these top two analogues would definitely favour a mild, potentially very mild pattern in February. And this is how March looks, interestingly. This doesn't really relate to winter forecast, but for these 2 years, 1914, 1938, we get a very westerly March with above average heights to the south and below average heights to the north. Now, if we was to look at a reanalysis for March 2019 so far, through the first week of March 2019, I reckon that will probably look fairly close, actually, to what's going on at the moment with March 2019, with the winds coming in from the west. So, within our analogues, actually, all the way along, we was probably seeing a mild winter, I have to say that, and I sort of interpreted it wrongly. So the fault for the winter forecast rests entirely with me. The fault for the forecast going wrong is entirely my fault. The analogues, if we take out the top two, or isolate out the top two analogues were definitely pointing us to a milder winter. This is how the overall top two winter 2018-19 analogues look. So, I mean, it's just quite a bit of high pressure out to the northwest. So again, suggestive of a dryish winter, really. Below average heights to our south, that's a little bit wrong. But I think once you drill down on the month by month, it's a little bit less obvious for the overall winter analogue of those two winters, 1913, 1914 and 1937, 1938. It's not quite so obvious for the overall winter analogue for those two winters. But once you drill down through the month by month, I think we was very strongly with those two being pointed towards the chance of a milder Atlantic-driven winter. Putting those top two analogues together in terms of the temperature anomaly, they were forecasting kind of like average temperatures for December. For January, look, that's quite interesting as well. In January, they was forecasting average temperatures for the UK, but quite a cold winter, really, for many parts of Europe. Again, but you'll notice particularly the core of the cold in January, very similar to where it did end up through France down to Spain, and then over into eastern and northeastern parts of Europe. Maybe Scandinavia should be a bit colder for January. But overall, I don't think that is too bad at all for how January, how the temperature anomaly was in January 2019. I think overall that's fairly reasonable. As I say, you'll never get a total like-for-like match with any month, putting the 2 months together. You'll never get a total 100% like-for-like match. But I think that's reasonably close to how the temperature anomalies came off during January. And then February, look, it's favoured to be a mild month across most parts of northern Europe. Maybe the core of the mild temperatures is kind of like a little bit east of where it actually was. So for these 2 years, February 1914, 1938, we sort of placed the mildest anomalies over Scandinavia and eastern, northeastern parts of Europe, whereas actually it's a little bit further west with the milder anomalies in that sort of area. That's a bit wrong, but the milder than average anomalies were kind of like covering that area. Nevertheless, it still points us to a significantly milder than average February for most parts of Northern Europe, and the UK would be included in that. Remember, these are from a very long time ago as well, these analogues, so you would add on a couple of degrees, take into account modern day sort of climate and the warming that's taken place over the past few years. You would have to add on a year or two from these. We get through to the winter overall temperature anomaly from these two, 1914 and 1938. Overall, it does look like a average winter, but then again, you would add on a degree or two to take into account the modern climate, and also suggesting a dry winter. This is how these top two analogue years look for precipitation. So again, we see a dry December is forecast for much of northern and western Europe, and to be fair, we did pick out this dry signal for our forecast. We did go for a dry winter, so for precipitation side played out much better than the temperature anomaly. For January, again, it favours a drier than average month. Once more, a little bit less so than December, but nevertheless still favouring drier than average. February, so in February we see a little bit similar for being a little bit above average to the far north of the UK, but again most parts of Europe are coming out drier than average, and so overall you would still favour quite a dry signal for February. Remember, February precipitation was actually close to average, though it was rather unsettled at the start of the month, and overall again it favours a dry winter, so we see drier than average with these two being favoured across much of particularly northern and western parts of Europe. So it's very interesting that our top two analogues all the way along were pointing us to a mild and dry winter, which is quite an unusual combination anyway, because normally if it's mild it tends to be wet. So for the analogues to be so strongly pointing towards a mild and dry winter, particularly as you get through towards February, very strongly favouring really mild conditions potentially in February, that's quite striking. And basically I should have gone with the top two analogues. If I'd gone with the top two analogues, the GWV Winter 2018-19 forecast would have been, I think, really very successful indeed, and we'd all be sort of celebrating now about how it went. As it was, I did take into account the top two analogues, but we also had the top 10 and to some degree the top 7, which were pointing us in a colder direction. So I had to make a gamble, and I thought the most likely scenario, maybe influenced a little bit by how the previous winter 17-18, had left off with that hint of much colder weather from the east. I thought that was kind of like a warning to us that the next winter would be quite cold, because that's normally what happens when you get that kind of short-lived latter stage cold spell in a final part of a winter. It's normally a warning from the atmosphere that the next winter is probably going to be quite cold. So I was influenced by that a bit. But nevertheless, the analogues, the top two analogues, were definitely pointing us to a mild and dry winter, and I made the wrong call. So that's all I can say when we issue these forecasts. We always have to raise our hands and say, if we got it wrong, we have to admit it, we have to be honest, we have to be open, we have to be transparent, and that's the way we build our reputation. So when we get our successes, that's fine, but when we get it wrong, it's important to say that, yes, we did get it wrong. And why did we get it wrong? We got it wrong in this case because I should have gone with the top two analogues as opposed to go with the top 10 or the top 7. But another time, maybe I'll go with the top 2 and they'd be wrong, and it would be the top 10 and the top 7. That would be correct. So a lot of this does come down to luck and to judgment calls, and on this occasion I made the wrong call. But the fault is entirely mine, because the analogues so frustrating. The analogues were telling us that this was probably going to be a mild and a dry winter. I know a lot of you are wondering why this happened through this winter, so I just want to talk a little bit about what went wrong with this winter from a cold perspective. So this was very remarkable as well. When we was doing the winter update, it's weatheriscool.com, and it's a depiction of the strength of the zone of winds over the North Pole. When we was doing the winter updates, one thing that's coming through very strongly was that the long-range CFSV2 was forecasting an early southern stratospheric warming, and this is another reason that I tended to favour cold a little bit more, because it was such a strong signal that we would get quite an early southern stratospheric warming. And we did actually get that. So this is this blue line here shows us that we did get the southern stratospheric warming early through the winter. We got a reversal of the zone of winds just after New Year, and 9 times out of 10 you would expect, because it was a very big southern stratospheric warming, it was a major reversal of the zone of winds. It did everything that you would want from a southern stratospheric warming. It propagated down to the troposphere, so it took a little time to do that, but really it did everything that you would want from a southern stratospheric warming, and the CFSV2 was correct with its forecast. So we always sort of criticise the CFSV2, but in terms of that early winter southern stratospheric warming, it did get that right. It was correct on that, and the upshot was, though, that we only got a partial response to it. There's some debate about whether we got any response. I think we did get a partial response to it, because we got the cold spell at the end of January. It was probably quite unlucky in those last 2 weeks of January with the exact core of the cold, and where the partial blocking was sitting. The real cold pushed down to North America. There's also plenty of cold going down into much of Europe as well, which is why many parts of Europe come away with a colder than average temperature anomaly during January. We was on the periphery of that, and we was probably quite unlucky to do so. Combined with that early signal for the southern stratospheric warming, which did come off, but we didn't get a full response to it this time. Combined with that, we also had all of the long-range models that were going for significant northern blocking, including what we regard as the best long-range model. So the UK Met long-range model was going for significant northern blocking through this winter, as was ECMWF. Most of the long-range models were doing that. One or two of them were a bit unsure about it. I think the Beijing Climate Centre was never fully committed. And out of all the long-range models from that final seasonal model roundup, I think the Beijing Climate Centre was the one that did give a little note of caution and suggested maybe it would be more of a mid-latitude high pressure. But it was a very strong signal from the long-range models for significant northern blocking through this winter. And I think primarily that was because they were all seeing the southern stratospheric warming. But what they didn't foresee was that we would only get a partial atmospheric or tropospheric response to that southern stratospheric warming. They all saw the warming of the stratosphere, and they all wanted to produce very substantial northern blocking within the troposphere from that southern stratospheric warming as a result of that southern stratospheric warming. But we didn't get such strong northern blocking. And the non-blocking that we did get in the second half of January kind of like left us on the periphery of cold conditions. So that's quite interesting how that came out. Also have to think about the NAO forecast. So the very first thing we do with our this is going on a little bit longer than I expected it to, but there's a lot to digest with this week, so I hope you're sticking with this and finding it interesting. The very first thing that we do when we issue our or when we start to do our winter updates, is look at the Atlantic sea surface temperature anomalies during the month of May, and then from that we issue an NAO forecast for the following winter. And this was a sea surface temperature anomaly that we had during May 2018. It was a very unusual anomaly. We had this horseshoe shape of cold here through the North Atlantic through the month of May 2018, with a much warmer area through this central part of the North Atlantic, if you see what I mean. And this is a strong indicator. We get this kind of pattern. It's a strong indicator for a positive NAO winter. The idea is that that sort of anomaly is going to last, or it will redevelop through the winter months. If that happens, that is a strong indicator for a positive NAO. So the very first thing we did back in July 2018, seems so long ago now, but back in July 2018, we issued the NAO forecast for the winter of 2018-19, and we said the sea surface temperature anomalies were favouring a positive NAO, which would favour a milder than average winter. So that side of the forecast came off correctly. Obviously, we did have a positive NAO winter combined with a negative AO winter, which is quite an unusual combination. But that side of the forecast, the NAO forecast, did perform okay. One of the things that went wrong, and this is again from NOAA, but this is from winter itself. This is sea surface temperature anomaly map from the 3rd of January 2019. One of the things that went wrong was with El Nino. We was expecting to get a Modoki or Modokai El Nino, which is a central base El Nino. What would happen then is that we would have a significantly warmer than average area through this central part of the Equatorial Pacific. It would be cooler over here towards Peru, and it would be cooler over towards Indonesia, and it would be warmer in the middle. When that happens, we call it a Modoki El Nino. That favours a colder pattern for both sides of the Atlantic. It favours a colder winter for much of North America, but also favours a colder winter for the UK, especially late in the winter. So that's one of the things that are pointing us towards a cold February. Now, we did not get any real El Nino of note. Not only did we not really get a Modoki El Nino, we didn't really get any El Nino of note. It was just a little bit warmer than average, just about getting to El Nino threshold, but not enough to have an atmospheric impact in the UK and Europe. So we certainly can't put this mild winter down to El Nino because it barely registered as an El Nino. It probably had an effect on the pattern in America because they're right next to the Pacific Ocean. But over on our side of the Atlantic, I don't think this El Nino had an effect either way, but certainly the Modokai El Nino never really turned up. So that's one of the reasons that the forecast went wrong. We was anticipating Modokai El Nino, we didn't get it. These warmer than average sea surface temperature anomalies in the northeastern part of the Pacific Ocean as well, something we've had a lot over the past several years. I don't think they're particularly good news if you want a cold European winter pattern. That will tend to send the jet stream across America on that sort of alignment, which will then blow up in the Atlantic, and that kind of like favours an Atlantic-driven flow. And you'll notice the Atlantic sea surface temperature anomalies from the middle of the winter showed no sort of signs of a tripod. So a tripod is when it's warm just here, and then it's cool just there, and then it's warm down there again. 3 distinct bands. When you get that sort of pattern in the Atlantic Ocean, you do favour a negative NAO. You favour a colder winter pattern for the UK and Europe, but we didn't get that. And we did keep this sort of horseshoe shape, although much weakened, but there was still that sort of suggestion of kind of like a horseshoe shape of cold from Greenland up there down to there. And I think the other thing that was very important for this winter was the transition into the westerly QBO, which actually happened quite rapidly. I was anticipating that the early part of the winter we might have held on to the easterly QBO. We've been in a strong easterly QBO phase since the middle of 2017, indicated by all of these negative numbers. But actually the transition occurred from kind of like October to November. That's when we started to move from the easterly to the westerly QBO. By December, we was actually in quite a strong westerly QBO phase, and that carried on into January and February as well. It's a rapid transition into the westerly QBO. Westerly QBOs favour an increased zonal flow. They favour milder winds overall. Although you can get cold winters with westerly QBO, it's happened several times in the past, but particularly a sort of a transition very quickly from an easterly to a westerly QBO through the early winter period probably favours a milder winter too. So put it all together, a lot went wrong with this winter in terms of if you wanted a colder winter. There was a lot that happened that went wrong if you want a cold winter. And we was also quite unlucky as well, particularly with the sudden stratospheric warming. Although we know from past experience that sudden stratospheric warmings are not a guarantee to get a northern blocking and a colder pattern during the winter. We do know this from past years, but it's been a long time since this happened. The sudden stratospheric warmings that we've had over the past few years have tended to favour really quite cold weather happening quite quickly. So I suppose this sudden stratospheric warming is a bit of a warning shot across our bows that we shouldn't necessarily see a sudden stratospheric warming and assume that it will get very cold from. And it does favour that we will get colder and we'll get northern blocking from a sudden stratospheric warming, but it doesn't guarantee. And I think this year does give us that sort of note of warning, brings us down to earth with a bump a little bit, if you like, after the sudden stratospheric warnings that we've had over the past few winters, particularly thinking of the one that preceded the beast from the east last winter, or winter before last, I suppose I should say now, and also the sudden stratospheric warming that we got in January 2013, that preceded the cold winter that occurred through January, February and into March 2013. So it's unlucky with that. There were several things that went wrong, but all that said, I can't put the failure of this forecast down to things going wrong, because if I'd gone with those top two analogues, we'd have had the winter pattern pretty much there, I think. So within the analogues, we was definitely being pointed to a milder and also a dry winter. And that side of the forecast did go wrong. Keep emphasising that. But that side of the forecast, the precipitation side of the forecast, went right. We forecast a dry winter. We had a dry winter. It's just the position of the blocking area of high pressure tending to be across Central Europe, I suppose, being high latitude or northern blocking. And the fault for that is entirely mine, because the analogues were pointing us to the correct answer for this winter, but I interpreted them wrong. So I can only apologise and say I'm sorry about that. Hold my hands up and say that the forecasts will go wrong at times. It's not an exact science. There's a lot of interpretation that has to go on with all of this, and hopefully we'll do better next time. You're only as good as your last forecast, and well, our last forecast went rather wrong. Hopefully we'll do better in the future, and that's all that you can say. We have to be honest, we have to be open, have to be transparent. You know that good or bad, whatever happens, we're going to tell you how it is. So you at least you know what you're going to get with GWV. You're going to get a straight up answer, and if it went wrong, we will say yes, this did go wrong, and we will explain why it went wrong, and hopefully we'll aim to do better next time. Alright, so that closes the door on the winter of 2018-19. I hope you found the winter updates. I hope you found them informative, even if the end result was rather a mixed bag to say the least, but we had a really good run of winter updates from September to the end of November last year, so I hope you found all of those interesting. And we're on into the spring forecast has been released, of course, last weekend. Summer updates are beginning, and can you believe we're only kind of like 3 months or so away from issuing the winter 2019-20 NAO forecast. So we're going to have a couple of months away from the winter stuff, but it won't be very long at all before we're having to start thinking about the NAO forecast for the winter of 2019-20. And then it'll be a case of buckle up and we'll start all over again. Right, don't forget to check out the first batch of summer analogues and also the GWV Sunday Roundup. Nearly 40 minutes. It's gone on a lot longer than I anticipated it would, but there has been so much to talk about. But at nearly 40 minutes, that's all for now, and thanks for watching.